On the morning of December 22, 1944, at 11:30 a.m., Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, received an ultimatum that would forever change how the world understands military courage. Surrounded by vastly superior German forces, without supplies, without reinforcements, and without apparent hope of survival, McAuliffe had to respond to a formal surrender demand from the Wehrmacht. His response? A single word. 4 letters that would become legend. But why would one word matter so much amid the chaos of war? Why would a one-syllable military command become one of the most iconic moments of World War II? The answer lies in what happened before that word was uttered. It lies in understanding a brutal truth about leadership under extreme pressure. Sometimes attitude is a more powerful weapon than artillery. To understand why McAuliffe's response mattered, you first need to understand the absolute impossibility of the situation at Bastogne. You need to feel the biting cold of December in the Ardennes. You need to see the circle closing around American soldiers who, by all conventional military logic, were already dead. December 1944, the Ardennes, Belgium. The Wehrmacht launched its last major offensive on the Western Front, Operation Herbstnebel, which the Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge. The German objective was simple and bold: split the Allied forces in half, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the British and Americans to negotiate a separate peace. It was Hitler's desperate gamble, throwing his last reserves in an attempt to change the inevitable course of the war. At the center of this gamble was the town of Bastogne, a small Belgian town that nobody outside the region knew. But Bastogne had something that made it absolutely critical. 7 major roads converged there, 7 arteries through which tanks, troops, and supplies could flow. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the Ardennes. The Wehrmacht needed that town and was willing to pay any price for it. The American 101st Airborne Division arrived at Bastogne on December 18th. Not because they were rested and prepared, not because they had adequate supplies. They arrived because they were the only available force that could move fast enough to get there before the Germans. Elite paratroopers without parachutes, mounted in trucks racing against panzers. General McAuliffe took command, not because he was the highest-ranking officer planned for that position, but because the division's regular commander, General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington. McAuliffe was the divisional artillery commander. Now he commanded an entire division about to be swallowed by the German war machine. On December 20th, just 2 days after the 101st's arrival, German forces completed the encirclement. Bastogne was completely isolated. No open roads, no functioning supply lines, no reinforcements coming. The Wehrmacht had deployed elements of 7 different divisions around the town: the 2nd Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr Division, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, Tiger tanks, heavy artillery, veteran infantry. The Americans were outnumbered at least 5 to 1. Some estimated 10 to 1. The numbers tell part of the story, but numbers don't capture the desperation of the situation. The American soldiers at Bastogne were freezing. Temperatures dropped well below zero. Snow covered everything, and most of the 101st's men had been rushed in without adequate winter equipment. Men lost fingers and toes to frostbite while trying to maintain defensive positions. Frozen trenches became death traps. Ammunition was running out. Every shot had to count. Artillerymen received orders to conserve shells, fire only at confirmed targets, only when absolutely necessary. For a surrounded defensive force, every unfired shell was a gap in the defenses that the Germans could exploit. Medical supplies were critically low. The wounded piled up in improvised aid stations. Surgeons operated by lantern light, without adequate anesthesia, without enough antibiotics, without blood for transfusions. Men died from wounds that would be treatable anywhere else. But Bastogne wasn't anywhere else. Bastogne was a frozen cauldron of slow death. Food was rationed to bare survival levels. Soldiers shared frozen K-rations, chewing crackers hard as stones, drinking coffee that froze before it cooled. Morale was under pressure. Not the morale of cowards, but the morale of rational men looking at a mathematically impossible situation. And in the midst of all this, German attacks continued. Constant probes, artillery bombardments, tank attacks. The Wehrmacht was tightening the noose, testing the defenses, looking for the weak point that would inevitably break an isolated force without supplies. On December 21st, the weather got even worse. Dense fog blanketed the region. This meant that even if there was a break in the clouds, the American Air Force couldn't drop supplies or provide air support. The paratroopers at Bastogne were truly alone, not just surrounded on the ground but invisible from the air. Conventional military logic was clear and brutal. A surrounded force without supplies, without reinforcements, facing enemies superior in numbers and firepower, had two options: fight to total annihilation, or negotiate terms of surrender while there was still something to negotiate. Rational commanders throughout history had chosen the second option in situations far less desperate than Bastogne. The Germans knew this. The Wehrmacht had enough combat experience to understand exactly the situation inside Bastogne. They knew about the cold, the hunger, the lack of ammunition. They knew time was on their side. Every passing hour made the American position more untenable. Surrender wasn't just probable, it was inevitable. It was in this context that on the morning of December 22nd, 2 German officers and 2 sergeants approached the American lines under a white flag of truce. They carried a formal message, an ultimatum. Military protocol was being followed. The Wehrmacht was offering honorable terms of surrender, a chance to save lives, an opportunity to avoid unnecessary annihilation. The ultimatum was delivered at 11:30 a.m. It was typed in both English and German, following formal protocols of war. The message was clear and contained a carefully calibrated implicit threat. The Germans appealed to the well-known American humanity, while warning about the annihilating artillery and air force that would be used if surrender were refused. The ultimatum gave the Americans 2 hours to respond. Inside the American command in Bastogne, the ultimatum reached McAuliffe's hands. He was in his command room, a reinforced basement, studying maps, coordinating defenses, trying to make the impossible work. When the ultimatum was translated and presented to him, McAuliffe had to make a decision that would define not only the fate of the 101st Division, but potentially the outcome of the entire Battle of the Bulge. The psychological pressure of that moment is hard to overstate. McAuliffe knew exactly how bad the situation was. He knew every number, every deficit, every vulnerability. He wasn't operating under heroic illusions. He was looking at the brutal reality of command. Thousands of men under his responsibility, freezing, dying, with no apparent hope of relief. The logical response, the response that military protocols and rational calculations suggested, was at least to seriously consider the terms. Negotiate, save lives while it was still possible. No one would blame him. The situation was beyond impossible. But there was another factor, something that didn't appear in tactical manuals or logistical calculations. McAuliffe understood something fundamental about leadership under pressure. Morale isn't just about realistic hope. It's about attitude. It's about the message sent not only to your men, but to the enemy. And McAuliffe knew the Wehrmacht was watching, waiting. The surrender of Bastogne wasn't just about capturing a town. It was about psychological momentum. It was about proving that the German offensive could break the American will. A surrender at Bastogne would send waves through the entire Allied line. McAuliffe's decision at that moment wasn't just tactical. It was strategic in the deepest sense. And it was personal. It reflected who he was as a leader, how he saw his role, how he understood what his men needed to hear, even surrounded by the impossible. And it was at this point that McAuliffe made his decision, not after long debates, not after extensive consultations with his staff. His response was instinctive. It was visceral. It was a rejection so complete of the logic of surrender that it defied military conventions. When asked what response should be sent to the Germans, McAuliffe said one word, a single word that perfectly captured his disdain for the idea of surrender. A word so American, so casual, so absolutely insubordinate to the formal protocols of war that his officers were momentarily stunned. But that word and what happened after it would be the subject of what came next. Because McAuliffe's decision didn't end when he spoke it. It needed to be communicated. It needed to be delivered to the Germans. And it needed somehow to be transformed into an official response that maintained both the spirit of McAuliffe's rejection and the minimum protocols of military communication. What happened in that command room over the next few hours would transform an instinctive response into military legend. and it would forever change how the world understood American resistance at Bastogne. The German officers waited in the adjacent room, confident they would receive a formal response of surrender. After all, the military situation was mathematically clear. 4 panzer divisions against 1 surrounded airborne division, no reinforcements in sight, scarce ammunition, brutal winter. No rational commander would reject such generous terms. McAuliffe held the German ultimatum. His staff officers gathered around. Colonel Kinnard, his G3, observed the general's expression. Major Alva Jones, operations officer, awaited instructions to draft the standard diplomatic response. Everyone assumed McAuliffe would follow established military protocol, a formal, respectful refusal, technically adequate to the standards of the Geneva Convention. McAuliffe read the ultimatum a second time. To the American commander of the encircled troops in Bastogne, the fortune of war is changing. You have been encircled by German armored forces. There is only one possibility to save the encircled troops from total annihilation: honorable surrender. He placed the paper on the table. This is ridiculous, said McAuliffe. Kinnard agreed. What are you going to reply, General? McAuliffe looked at the ultimatum again, then at his officers. A pause, then a single word. Well, I think I'll tell them nuts. The room fell silent for a moment. Then laughter. Kinnard smiled broadly. That's perfect, sir. Absolutely perfect. But there was still the problem of formality. The Germans expected an official response on letterhead, properly signed. McAuliffe picked up a pen and wrote on a sheet of paper. December 22nd, 1944, to the German commander, nuts. The American commander, 7 words, 23 characters, one of the most audacious military responses in modern history. Kinnard held the paper, still smiling. So the Germans might not understand what nuts means. It's American slang. Then you explain it to them, McAuliffe replied. As clearly as possible. Colonel Joseph Harper was assigned to deliver the message. He walked to the room where the 2 German officers, a major and a captain, were waiting with their emissaries. The Germans stood up, expecting a formal response, possibly a request for clarification on surrender terms, perhaps a negotiation. Harper handed the folded paper to the German major. The major opened it, read it, frowned. He turned the paper over, checking if there was more text on the back. Nothing, just that singular, puzzling word. What does this mean? The major asked in hesitant English. Nuts, we don't understand. Harper smiled. It's a definitively negative response. The major still looked confused. Negative? Just negative? If you don't understand what nuts means, Harper said, his voice hardening, in plain English it means the same thing as go to hell. And I'll tell you one more thing. If you continue to attack, we're going to kill every damn German we can. The German captain finally understood. He quickly translated for the major, whose expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to something resembling controlled anger. You will fight then? The major asked. We will fight, Harper confirmed. The German officers were escorted back to German lines in silence. The major held the paper with that single word, as if it were an incomprehensible artifact. At German High Command, when the rejected ultimatum reached General von Lüttwitz, the reaction was shock, complete shock. They expected negotiation. They expected to haggle over surrender terms. They expected, at the very least, a formal response acknowledging the dire American military situation. What they received instead was pure defiance, condensed into a single colloquial word. The psychology of that moment was extraordinary. McAuliffe didn't use pompous military rhetoric. He didn't cite regulations or strategic principles. He didn't make elaborate threats or heroic declarations. He simply sent a word that communicated absolute confidence, complete contempt for the German proposal, and zero interest in discussion. The subliminal message was devastating. You're not serious enough to deserve a formal response. In the American lines, the word spread like wildfire. The general said, nuts, or to the Germans. McAuliffe told them to go to hell with one word. We're not going to surrender. Nuts to them. Pilots in Bastogne repeated the story. Soldiers in the frozen trenches laughed for the first time in days. Mechanics repairing damaged tanks under artillery fire smiled when they heard. Morale, which had been under extreme pressure due to the siege, limited ammunition and brutal cold, experienced an immense psychological boost. McAuliffe didn't just reject surrender, he did it in a way that transformed the situation from desperate to defiant. The attitude shifted from "we're surrounded and outnumbered" to "these Germans are ridiculous for thinking we'll surrender." This psychological shift was, in tactical terms, as valuable as a battalion of reinforcements. A soldier from the 101st Airborne Division, Private First Class John Taylor, wrote in his diary that night, "General McAuliffe said nuts to the Krauts. If he thinks we can hold out, then we'll hold out. They can surround us, but they won't break us." The response became legendary instantly. War correspondents who arrived in Bastogne after the siege was broken sought out McAuliffe specifically to confirm the story. The Associated Press distributed the news worldwide within 48 hours after the German surrender demand was rejected. In the United States, newspapers printed headlines, "American General Responds Nuts," to German ultimatum at Bastogne. The word nuts appeared in editorials, political cartoons, radio broadcasts. It became a symbol of American resistance, of confidence under pressure, of refusal to accept defeat even when logically outmatched. The U.S. War Department, initially hesitant about the informal language in official communications, quickly recognized the propaganda value. The story was incorporated into morale materials for troops, broadcast to the home front, and even in leaflets dropped over German positions. The message to the Germans was clear. The Americans were not intimidated. The message to Allied forces was equally potent. The 101st Airborne was holding Bastogne with attitude and determination. But there was something else German command didn't fully grasp at that moment. The nuts response wasn't just propaganda or empty talk. It was psychology weaponized at the highest strategic level. McAuliffe knew that the Germans were operating on a tight schedule. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive, depended on speed. Every day that Bastogne held out was a day that panzer divisions couldn't advance toward deeper objectives. Every hour of delay allowed the Allies to reorganize defenses, move reinforcements, prepare counterattacks. By responding with absolute defiance instead of negotiation, McAuliffe signaled to the Germans that Bastogne would not be surrendered peacefully. They would have to take the city by force, which would consume time, ammunition, and casualties, resources the Wehrmacht couldn't afford to waste at that stage of the war. Von Lüttwitz, upon receiving the nuts response, faced a critical tactical decision. He could divert significant forces to crush Bastogne immediately, delaying the overall advance. Or he could maintain the siege with minimal forces and continue pushing west, risking that Bastogne would become a bigger problem later. He chose the second option, a strategic mistake that time would reveal. Meanwhile, in the trenches around Bastogne, American soldiers held defensive positions with renewed morale. The word nuts was painted on helmets, written on bunker walls, shouted in defiance during German attacks. A lieutenant from Company E, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, recalled, "When the Germans attacked our position on the morning of December 23rd, our men shouted, 'Nuts!' as they fired. It was as if the word had become our rallying cry, our battle cry." The psychological transformation was complete. An objectively desperate military situation had been narratively reframed into an epic of heroic resistance. And all because of a word chosen not for its diplomatic value, but for its brutal emotional authenticity. McAuliffe didn't plan to create one of the most famous military quotes of the 20th century. He simply responded with visceral honesty to what he considered an absurd proposal. But that authenticity was precisely what made the response so powerful. In German propaganda offices, analysts worked overtime trying to decode the American response. What did nuts really mean for American morale? Was it genuine confidence or just desperate bluffing? Did the 101st Airborne truly believe they could hold out? Or was McAuliffe playing poker with lives? These questions revealed the true psychological impact. The Germans were now questioning their own assessments of the situation. If the Americans were so confident in rejecting surrender, perhaps there were factors German intelligence hadn't considered. Perhaps reinforcements were closer than reported. Perhaps American defenses were stronger than they appeared. Uncertainty had been injected into German planning. And in war, uncertainty breeds hesitation. Hesitation breeds delays. Delays breed opportunities. McAuliffe had bought time with a single word. But what he didn't know And what the Germans certainly didn't know was that while that word spread through the lines, something was happening southeast of Bastogne that would completely change the balance of the battle. Patton's Third Army, 60 miles to the south, had received emergency orders to reorient its entire offensive 90 degrees north. 6 divisions, 133,000 men, were executing one of the most complex military maneuvers of modern warfare, and they were moving toward Bastogne. The Germans surrounding the city had no idea their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. They had interpreted nuts as the desperate defiance of a doomed force. In reality, it was the calculated confidence of a commander who knew he only had to hold on a little longer. The word nuts wasn't just a response to an ultimatum. It was a psychological strategy wrapped in 4 letters. It was time-bought disguised as bravado. It was war psychology applied with surgical precision by a general who understood that in battle, perception can be as powerful as firepower. McAuliffe had transformed a moment of potential weakness, the need to respond to a surrender ultimatum, into a demonstration of strength. And in the next 72 hours, that demonstration would be validated in a way neither side could have fully predicted in that moment. Because Patton was coming, and when he arrived, the nuts response would be remembered not as bravado, but as prophecy. As the word nuts spread through Allied lines and confused the German command, unknown to the Wehrmacht, General George S. Patton was leading a race against time. The American Third Army was advancing toward Bastogne through frozen roads and dense forests. McAuliffe's defiant response had bought something no amount of ammunition could buy: critical time. The Germans didn't realize that psychological warfare had served a much larger tactical purpose. While Lüttwitz tried to decipher the exact meaning of nuts, while officers debated whether it was code or insult, while Wehrmacht soldiers wondered what kind of commander would respond that way to a reasonable surrender proposal, 60 precious hours passed. Every hour McAuliffe held out, American forces drew closer. Every minute of German confusion was one less minute of pursuit. The defense of Bastogne wasn't just about holding military positions. It was about keeping hope alive long enough for the cavalry to arrive. And then, on December 26, 1944, something broke the siege. General Patton's 4th Armored Division smashed through German lines south of Bastogne. German tanks advanced through stunned enemy positions, opening a supply corridor directly into the besieged city. German forces, who had expected an imminent surrender, were caught completely unprepared by American determination and the swift relief. What happened in the next 48 hours would completely change the dynamics of the Battle of the Bulge. Supplies flowed into Bastogne: ammunition, food, medical equipment. The wounded were evacuated. Reinforcements arrived. The city that should have fallen in 24 hours had held for a full week and was now being resupplied. The German response was one of absolute tactical shock. Intelligence reports captured later revealed that Wehrmacht officers couldn't believe the Americans had managed to organize such a rapid relief operation. They had fundamentally underestimated 2 critical factors: Patton's speed and the morale of the Bastogne garrison. And at the center of that morale was a single word: nuts. Hadn't just confused the Germans, it had become a battle cry. American soldiers who heard about McAuliffe's response fought with renewed intensity. Those who were surrounded knew their commander wouldn't abandon them. Those coming to the rescue knew they were saving men who refused to give up. The breaking of the siege at Bastogne represented the turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. German momentum, which had been built on speed and surprise, was completely destroyed at a critical junction. Hitler had gambled everything on this offensive. Bastogne was the key, and McAuliffe kept it locked. But the story didn't end with tactical victory. What happened in the months and years that followed would demonstrate the true power of that one-word response. Military academies around the world began studying the Bastogne case, not just the defensive tactics, not just the limited resource strategy, but specifically McAuliffe's psychological response. How a single word had influenced morale on both sides. How psychological warfare had bought tactical time. Military historians cited nuts as a masterpiece of unplanned psychological warfare. Colonel S.L.A. Marshall, renowned U.S. Army historian, described the response as the most effective morale communication in modern military history. Other analysts noted that McAuliffe had instinctively grasped something that would take decades to formalize into doctrine: the importance of attitude in modern warfare. Official recognition came quickly. McAuliffe received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military award in the U.S. Armed Forces. But more important than any medal was what happened next. The story of nuts spread far beyond military circles. American newspapers published the full story. Magazines reproduced the dialogue. Radio stations narrated the siege. And in every version, that single word stood out. Nutsworks became a symbol of American resistance, a refusal to accept defeat when defeat seemed inevitable. The cultural impact was profound. At a time when America was fighting a global war, when victory wasn't guaranteed, when sacrifice was constant, McAuliffe's story offered something powerful: proof that attitude mattered, that morale could overcome numbers, that a commander with courage and the right word could change the course of battles. And it influenced actual military doctrine. The United States Armed Forces began incorporating lessons from Bastogne into leadership training. McAuliffe's response became a case study on how commanders should think under pressure, not following rigid protocols, not accepting enemy assumptions, but responding with authenticity, with courage, with psychology. Officers in training learned a critical lesson: war isn't just about weapons superiority or numbers. It's about will. It's about breaking the enemy's confidence. It's about keeping your own troops believing. And sometimes, it's about a single word that says it all. McAuliffe's approach influenced future psychological operations, propaganda missions, communication strategies, the understanding that what you say to the enemy can be as important as what you fire at them. That morale is a tactical resource, not just an emotional bonus. The legacy of nuts became cultural shorthand for defiant resilience. Politicians quoted the word in speeches about national determination. Coaches used it to inspire teams facing impossible odds. Business leaders referenced it when describing refusals to give up in tough markets. But beyond the cultural symbolism, there was a deeper strategic lesson. McAuliffe, an individual commander facing an impossible situation, had reframed the understanding of warfare through pure intuition. He hadn't consulted psychological operations manuals. He hadn't calculated the morale impact of his response. He simply responded with raw human authenticity in a moment of absolute pressure. And that authenticity resonated precisely because it wasn't calculated. This is the paradox of the nuts moment. It was effective because it was genuine. It was powerful because it was simple. It was memorable because it was unexpected. In a world of complex military protocols, elaborate strategies, formal communications, a single piece of American slang cut through everything. The Germans expected diplomacy. They received defiance. They expected rational calculation. They received emotional courage. They expected a response they could process through conventional military structures. They received something that defied categorization, and that froze them at exactly the critical moment. The initial promise made at the beginning of this story was simple. Why did a single word matter so much? The answer is now complete. Nuts mattered because it encapsulated a truth about human conflict that transcends weapons and strategy. That attitude can reshape reality. That morale is a force multiplier as potent as any tank or aircraft. That bold thinking, applied at the right moment, can overcome conventional military wisdom. McAuliffe didn't know he was making history when he told those German officers to go away with a single word. He was simply being honest about his intention. But that honesty, at that moment with that audience, created ripples that changed not just the Battle of Bastogne, but the understanding of psychological warfare for generations. McAuliffe's lasting impact is visible today. Every time a leader faces impossible odds and chooses defiance over capitulation, the spirit of nuts is present. Every time someone refuses to accept the adversary's narrative about what's possible, that legacy continues. The timeless lesson is clear. Bold leadership in impossible circumstances isn't about superior resources. It's about refusing to play by the enemy's rules. It's about understanding that how you respond can matter more than how much you possess. It's about recognizing that psychology, morale, and attitude are battlefields as critical as any physical terrain. Anthony McAuliffe held Bastogne with insufficient men, inadequate supplies, and minimal chances. But he had something no German force could overcome, an absolute refusal to accept defeat as inevitable. And he communicated that refusal with clarity so perfectly sharp that a single word was enough. That's the real victory of Bastogne. Not just that the city didn't fall, but that the story of how it stood became permanent proof that bold thinking and psychological courage can literally change the reality of impossible situations. If you want to explore more impossible military moments where unconventional thinking changed history, where individual commanders reshaped battles through courage and psychological insight, subscribe to the channel. Discover more hidden stories that changed warfare. Join thousands learning the secrets of military ingenuity. And leave a comment. What other impossible military moment would you like us to cover? What bold decision, what unexpected response, what refusal to accept defeat do you want to understand deeply? Because history is full of these moments, and each one offers the same powerful lesson that McAuliffe proved at Bastogne. That sometimes a single word at the right moment can be worth more than 1,000 tanks.